Welcome to this very special event. My name is Minouche Shafik, and I'm the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. At LSE, our motto is to know the causes of things, and it was chosen to support our founding purpose for the betterment of society. Our role in establishing forestLAB is the latest innovative example of how we're bringing that purpose to life in a way that addresses one of the greatest challenges facing us in the 21st century, the challenge of climate change. forestLAB is a research and innovation program focused on pioneering world-class models for land management that is environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable. It's a partnership between the LSE's Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment, the University of Stirling, and the African Conservation Development Group. forestLAB is also partnering with the National Research Institute of Gabon, CNRS, where the initial research program will be based and where world-leading scientific research into tropical forest systems is being conducted. One of forestLAB's objectives is to help mentor and support future generations of scientific researchers in Africa so that they too will learn the causes of things and better their own societies. forestLAB's intention is to encourage partnerships with leading academic institutions and harness multidisciplinary expertise, which we believe is critical to advancing and addressing the development challenges and devising climate-smart models that are appropriate for Africa. This pre-COP26 event hosted by LSE marks the launch of forestLAB and is its first engagement with key stakeholders and the media. So welcome to that. At LSE, we're also thinking about the economic issues. The recent Dasgupta review showed how we have grossly underinvested in natural capital. And the World Bank estimates that it is an untapped market of over $100 trillion in missed opportunities to invest in the environment. Identifying the places on Earth that play a disproportionately important role in combating climate change and protecting nature is obviously key to where those investment returns are highest. Today, we're highlighting the role of Africa's highly forested nations in boosting global carbon sequestration. Central Africa's tropical forests are the second largest in the world and absorb close to 4% of the world's emissions. Studies have shown that due to deforestation, the Brazilian Amazon is now a net carbon emitter. It's a sobering reminder that in the absence of deliberate policy and investment, the global ecosystem services that these forests provide can't be taken for granted. So I very much welcome the establishment of forestLAB as an innovative platform that will help address the critical need to conserve our planet's natural capital while simultaneously making economic and social progress in those countries. I'm looking forward to this panel discussions, which will explore how Africa's carbon superpowers can advance this important endeavor. And so now I'm going to turn to Alistair Jump at the University of Stirling, a founding partner in forestLAB, to take over from me.
Hello to everyone, and thank you for your introduction, Minouche. I'm delighted to be here, and it should really come as no surprise to anyone that I really share the excitement at the opportunities forestLAB brings. And I'm particularly pleased to be launching the new work in Gabon. As you've noted, a growing body of research shows that African rainforests play a critically important role in determining Earth's future climate, and supporting the African carbon superpowers to preserve their forests alongside economic development is an absolute imperative. Historically, we know that forests have been lost and indeed continue to be lost as land is turned over to more economically attractive uses. And so the challenge that we face now is to find economic development models that support forest preservation in all countries, but most pressingly, of course, in high forest cover, low deforestation countries. And we believe that harnessing multidisciplinary expertise is key to tackling complex environmental challenges and associated development challenges, and ensuring that climate-smart approaches are embedded within this. Scotland's new International Environment Centre, based at Stirling, is founded on this belief, and forestLAB fits perfectly into that vision. Our ecological research program in Gabon began back in 1980, and over 40 years of forest monitoring has shown that the Gabonese forest is responding to climate changes. In fact, there's no other site in Africa with such a long-term record of forest function. Since 1986, we've learned that we've recorded a 1-degree rise in mean temperature and a drop in annual rainfall of over 300 millimeters in central Gabon. And although African forests are not dying off in the way that some Amazonian forests have begun to, the trees are indeed slowing their productivity. And we see that many species now renew their leaves less often, they fruit and flower less reliably. And this, of course, has knock-on impacts on animals as food resources become less plentiful and less predictable. And what this really demonstrates to us, of course, is that the crisis of biodiversity loss is inextricably linked to the climate crisis. And consequently, supporting high forest, low deforestation countries has enormous importance for biodiversity positive, as well as carbon positive outcomes. Our research has always been co-produced with Gabon's national institutions and focused on the research needs of Gabon and the wider region. And our involvement in establishing forestLAB really marks the next chapter, bringing our work to new audiences, both within Gabon and internationally, and integrating it into novel climate-smart business practice. I'm absolutely thrilled that CNRS, the National Centre for Science, whose staff have been at the centre of carbon research in Africa, will be working with us to develop forestLAB. And at this point, I'm very happy indeed to be able to pass over to Professor Ngamanda, the General Commissioner of CNRS, to continue.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about at forestLAB inaugural events. I'm Alfred Ngamanda. I'm the General Director of CNRS, which is the Gabon National Research Center of Science and Technology. I'm very glad about the new scientific partnership we have now with the forestLAB and other academic institutions which support these initiatives. Gabon has a proud history of scientific research and collaborations with international institutions. For example, we are working with the University of Stirling since 20 years, and we have together many ongoing research projects focused on tropical forest ecology. Over the past decades, we have launched a research program on beekeepers in collaborations with many Japanese and other international partnerships, and set up a new research station in one of the famous national park of Gabon, Kalavadoudou, for supporting the development of ecotourism based on gorilla and git apis vision. CNRS is working also on forest carbon measurements and monitoring. Myself, I'm working in development of methodology to measure and to monitoring carbon in forest. And we expect that with forestLAB research program in Gabon, we will enhance your partnership with other university, international university, and we will focus your attention on capacity building of our institution and studentships in Gabon. I hope, and I would like to welcome every institution which will come to Gabon for working on forest and carbon value, because this is one of the new research topic we have to develop for enhancing your capacity. As we know, Gabon is one of the famous country with a lot carbon stock in its forest, and we have to measure to monitoring this carbon for more enhanced climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ngamanda, and thank you, Professor Jump, and thank you, Baroness Shafik. I'm Elizabeth Robinson. I'm director of the Grantham Institute, and I will be introducing and moderating our panel today. So, and of course, thank you everyone, to all the participants who are joining the discussion today. It's I think it's quite a powerful testimony, isn't it, to the testament to the urgency of the conversation, the depth of the collective will there is to make progress in this area. And if we look at our list of participants, you guys are a diverse bunch. We've got government, we've got multilaterals, we've got businesses, institutional investors, NGOs, media, and academia. And not only a broad group of sectors, but a very diverse group of people from all around the world. I think we've got all continents bar Antarctica, as far as I could see. But of course, particularly pleased to see strong participation from Central Africa. So thank you to the people introducing today, and thank you to all of you who have joined us. And now let me just introduce our panelists. I think if they put the cameras on now, we might see them all. Okay, the first person I'm going to introduce to you is Professor Lee White. He is the Gabonese Republic's Minister of Water, Forests, the Sea and the Environment, but also he's charged with climate change, sustainable development goals and land use plannings. So he is by training a scientist and by background a conservationist. He spent over 30 years studying and then protecting Central African forests as the head of the Gabonese National Parks Agency. He also led the Gabonese negotiating team at the UNFCCC at COP21 in Paris, particularly important now we're 5 years on at COP26, and he's published around 70 papers. I know these numbers keep jumping up, around 70 papers and book chapters and 7 books. So welcome, Lee. Also on our panel today, we have Berta Pesti. She is head of the Secretariat for the Central African Forest Initiative, CAFI or CAFI, at the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP. She was formerly technical advisor for REDD+ Finance and a technical specialist on climate change at UNDP, and also delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross. So welcome, Berta. And third, we have Alan Bernstein. He's a pioneer of conservation-led development. He's founded, invested in, and successfully scaled a series of award-winning sustainable development enterprises in Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, and Europe. Spans almost the breadth of our participants' geographical spread here. And over the past 30 years, he's also led teams in developing new approaches to climate finance, particularly through the securitization of environmental rights and emerging capital market mechanisms for investment in forest land conservation. And I do feel, sort of having listened to Baroness Shafik's introductions, that's a particularly important element of the conversation today on climate change and conservation. Unfortunately and regrettably, Tanguy Gahumba Kale is not able to attend. He sends his apologies. I know he really wanted to be with us. He's the chair of the African Group of Negotiators on Climate Change for COP26. He's serving as special advisor to the President of the Republic of Gabon. He's a busy man, and we thought he'd be able to join us, but he can't. So we have on our panel 3 very distinguished panelists. And to coin a cliche, without further ado, we'll go to questions. So just to let you all know the format, I'm going to be putting some questions to our panelists under a series of sort of thematic areas. And then at around 5 p.m. British summer time, and I say that with lack of irony, it was 20 degrees outside today, so we had a strange summer day in the middle of October. But around 5 p.m. British summer time, we'll open to Q&A. So if you have any questions, I don't know if we'll have time for all the questions because we have to wrap up the panel at around 5:20 for our closing comments. But if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to put those questions to the panelists. So I thought, first of all, just for us to get a sense of the importance of highly forested, low deforestation nations, which we may be referring to as HFLD, well, that's harder to say than the actual full thing, in the climate change discussion. Lee, I just wanted to go to you first, please, and just ask you, What specific roles do you feel that HFLD nations play in combating climate change, and why is this globally significant? Oh, and you're still muted.
There, it works better like that, doesn't it?
Sometimes.
If we look at the Congo Basin as a case study, we often feel that we are slightly neglected, that all of the attention is paid to the Amazon because the Amazon is 3 times bigger. But we, whilst only a third the size of the Amazon, we have not quite half, but getting on for half the carbon stock. So our forests store more carbon per hectare than the Amazon forests. And tragically, today, the Congo Basin forests are absorbing about 5 times more carbon per hectare than the Amazon. The Amazon is sickening because of climate change. And so the Congo Basin as a carbon sink is proving more resilient to climate change than the Amazon. And so one reason why countries covered in forests are so important is, you know, there's a positive and negative. The positive is the forests, at least in Africa, the forests continue to grow and to add carbon and therefore to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And I didn't know the figure that was cited at the very beginning, that 4% of global emissions are sucked into the Congo Basin forests. We also hold a stock of carbon. We don't talk about it so much because I feel, at least, when we underline how important our stock of carbon is, it feels a little bit like we're threatening the world, that if you don't support us, we'll cut it all down and it will go into the atmosphere. But tragically, deforestation is the norm. Pretty much every country on Earth that has developed has done so whilst cutting down its forests. And the Congo Basin forests hold about 6 years of global emissions in trust. And so were we to lose control of the Congo Basin forests and were they to burn, that's 6 years of global emissions. IPCC are telling us we have 8 to 10 years to set the world right. So if we were to lose 6 years of Congo Basin, if we were to lose the Amazon, if we were to lose Southeast Asia, we would be in a very bad way. We certainly wouldn't be looking at a 1.5 degree world, we'd be looking at a 4 to 5 to 6 degree world. And so there were, but the sort of the carbon and the potential pollution and the removal of pollution from the atmosphere is just one of the things these forests do. If we look at, again, Congo Basin, if you next time you watch CNN, if you watch the clouds on the weather forecast drifting around Africa, you'll probably notice that the clouds over Gabon and northern Congo are all drifting up towards the Nigerian Sahel. And so Western Congo Basin contributes to the rainfall in the Sahel. Eastern Congo Basin contributes to the rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands, which fills the Blue Nile, which irrigates Egypt. And so the Congo Basin forests are the heart and lungs of Africa, influencing agriculture in Egypt. And were we to lose those precious ecosystem services, which we don't understand very well still. You know, one of the things forestLAB is going to do is to do cutting edge science. You know, we need to better understand these linkages and the value of these forests. I was in Kew Gardens about 3 weeks ago with Prince Charles and President Bongo, and they showed us a botanical collection of a coffee species in Sierra Leone. It's a lowland rainforest coffee species that tastes apparently better than Arabica and had been lost for 50 years. And they've just rediscovered it. And so great hope for the global coffee industry, because we've refound that genetic diversity that is stored in a little forest in Sierra Leone. And so there are many reasons, medicinal plants and cosmetics and so on, that these rainforest countries are precious, and the HFLD countries that harbor the most rainforest are even more precious, because that's where the forests are stable, and that's where we have the best chance of keeping them standing.
Thank you. That's a really useful start, isn't it? Just to put in context, just to have some numbers to show just the importance, one in terms of climate change, but all those other environmental benefits. And can I just ask you a follow-up question? If we now hone in on Gabon, because as we know, a lot of Gabon has remained forested, and unlike other countries, and so maybe you can sort of talk to us about Gabon's long history of environmental stewardship, and maybe just mention a few of the specific measures the country's taken to conserve its forests, and whether we have sort of evidence, if you like, that this has had a direct impact on carbon sequestration.
Okay. When we talk about carbon sequestration, we're often told, well, that's just a natural process. And I would retort that if that's the case, why aren't all tropical rainforest countries net absorbers of CO2 like Gabon? So the maintaining Gabon's standing stock of trees and carbon is something that we have committed to. It's something that our head of state committed to in Copenhagen. It's something that Omar Bongo, the late Omar Bongo, committed to in Rio in 92. And over the last 20 years, we've taken a succession of policy decisions, decisions to strengthen institutions that have all contributed to the fact that over the last 3 decades, we've maintained our deforestation below 0.1%. And I always hesitate to say it because I'm a scientist and I want to be 100% sure, but I think Gabon is the most carbon positive country on Earth today. So back in 2001, there was a revolutionary new forest law that made sustainable forestry obligatory, changed the way forestry was done in Gabon. And at the time, 20 years ago, most of the foresters were foresters who had worked in Ivory Coast and who had cut down all the forests in Ivory Coast and were starting to do the same thing in Gabon. In 2002, President Omar Bongo announced the creation of 13 national parks. He cancelled 2 million hectares of logging concession, and he changed there was an inflection in the sort of the forest policy and conservation policy that probably changed the course of history in Gabon. In 2007, we passed a law to finalize the creation of the parks and created the National Parks Agency that's played a leading role in fighting illegal forestry and poaching. 2009, we banned the export of logs. We worked out that when we exported a log, we retained 8% of the value of that log, and 92% of the value was gifted to the outside world. In many ways, that's the tragedy of development in Africa. Africa is a source of cheap raw natural materials, and we, the rest of the planet has developed on the back of Africa's natural resources. But we banned the export of logs, and now our forest economy is 3 times bigger, based on half as much timber. We created a climate council, a national climate plan, a sustainable development law in 2014. We passed a climate change law 2 weeks ago. So there have been a continuous evolution. We've strengthened our institutions. We've fought climate change. We've fought poaching. Often in many African countries, elephants are a great indicator of natural resource governance. We've lost 75% of the elephants across the Congo Basin in the last 20 years, but Gabon's population of elephants has increased by 50%, bucking that trend. And so the fact that we have this carbon sink today and that it's healthy is very much a matter of strong leadership and I would say courageous policy decisions.
Thank you. That's really interesting and segues nicely into the next question, which I'm going to put to Alan. So I just want to move the discussion a little bit now towards challenges and gaps in valuing natural capital. And Lee, you did sort of talk about, the value of timber and how much stays in the African continent. And to some extent, valuing timber is relatively easy. Once it's been cut and sold, we've got a price. But Alan, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about sort of, just to give us some background information, so we all really understand what are the current globally recognized mechanisms to recognize and value natural capital, and do you think they're working efficiently, and do you think they're working equitably as well?
Firstly, thank you very much, Liz, and thank you everybody on the panel, Lee, Minouche, Alistair, Alfred. It's great to see you, and it's wonderful to be able to participate today in the launch of forestLAB. It's an interesting question, and it's one that to be honest, I haven't really focused on. As a sort of a general perspective, I can tell you though that our approach, just to continue on from Lee's remarks, our approach commenced really in 2007. We first arrived in Gabon in 2007. And at the time, we were involved in what we would have called or declared to be sustainable forestry, very low impact logging, but with a business model that simply anchored itself on exporting high value hardwoods with minimal investment in the country in the most sustainable and low impact way we could, of course, but nevertheless leaving very little in the country in the context of what Lee's been describing. Within a couple of years, of course, the president banned the export of unprocessed logs, and we needed to take a very, very careful look at what to do next. And I think that really provides the essence of the answer that I'd give you. So on the one hand, we could have stopped operations. On the other hand, given our philosophy and our thinking in relation to sustainable development, it became very clear to us that we ought to engage in a careful program of considered investment and development over the period going forward. And if you take a look at what we held at the time, it really was the right to log a very small area of southern Gabon. And if one were to invest the substantial capital that would be required in order to process from the forest, clearly, if one were to proceed on a sustainable basis, we needed to literally quadruple or even more the scale of our operations or the forest land from which we were operating in order to operate on a low impact basis. And as soon as you do that, if you're looking at risk management the way that we do, one really has to examine what happens just outside the forest areas and start looking at an entire ecosystem approach. One has to look at the sort of infrastructure that's necessary. One has to look at very carefully at the people that live in the area, think carefully about the biodiversity, think about the wildlife, and then of course the other important opportunities and obligations that follow with a vast ecosystem-wide integrated landscape approach. So I think without going too far off track, for me, the idea of nature-based investment and about considering how to proceed in areas such as this is all about risk management. And so one has to, in terms of what's available for investment communities today, it's about firstly regulation. It's quite clear to me that there's a building set of rules, if you will, which are starting to govern and direct the way in which investors wish to see their capital deployed. It's still very, very opaque. And of course, on topic for COP26, the big question which will follow is what is likely to emerge in relation to the climate change scene, and particularly in relation to emerging carbon markets. How do you establish pricing? How do you establish how best to deploy your capital in ways which conform to whatever your national requirements are, your corporate requirements are, and so on. In the case of Gabon, I think, again, as Lee has outlined, we engaged and we're very, very privileged to participate in a process which led progressively to the establishment of a framework within which one is able to carefully and properly assess the investment prospects, understand very clearly the scale of the capital that ought to be deployed, the time scale as well as the quantum. And on that basis, with the emerging sustainable development law, with the more recent climate law, and with a very rigorous set of rules governing the way in which forestry operations are conducted, ecotourism operations are conducted, and the related infrastructure investments ought to be or have to be deployed. So one is able to carefully measure the expected outcome, the returns, and the risk profile of what one is considering over the long term. So I don't know if that gives you any kind of real answer to the question, but for us, it's about an integrated, landscape-wide, long-term series of investment and development plans, all of which are designed around optimizing land use rights with the very specific requirements that have been put in place, in this case, by the Gabonese Republic in relation to attracting long-term investment and development processes on a sustainable basis. And that, to me, is what one ought to be looking for in terms of the global investment scene from a sustainable development perspective.
Thank you. That's great. Really interesting. I think it's it's really nice to get that perspective of someone who's working in the area and really understands the local context. Berta, I'm going to take you to maybe a slightly sort of I don't know if it's a more philosophical question, but it's certainly something that a lot of people discuss, argue about, in terms of whether we should sort of reward, as it were, countries where there hasn't been deforestation. So some people have argued that countries shouldn't be rewarded for what one might term a natural process, carbon sequestration, though Lee has very nicely articulated why we would argue that it isn't. But there, should countries that have conserved their forests, should they actually not receive additional credit? So I'm not sure if people in the audience who are familiar with REDD, reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. But the idea is you're rewarding for avoided deforestation and degradation, what you do about countries where they haven't had any deforestation because they've actually protected their forests. So I'd be curious to know, and I'm sure the full participants would be too, what is CAFI's view on whether and how, which is as important if not more, highly forested countries like Gabon, or even others if we look at other regions such as Bhutan, Suriname, Republic of Congo, how should and how can they be rewarded for conserving forests?
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you very much for the invitation and for this really interesting question. It's a criticism that we have received when we signed our first results-based payment agreement with the government of Gabon 2 years ago. So it's a very relevant question. Maybe before answering, just to say who we are. So the Central African Forest Initiative is a multi-donor trust fund of the UN. It has actually become the largest UN-managed trust fund in the field of climate change, which is quite great because it's dedicated exclusively to the protection of Central African forests and obviously supporting poverty reduction efforts. So in the context of this, in the framework of this trust fund, we work with the countries of Central Africa, including Gabon, to understand the threats that they have, either current or future, on their forests, and try to support their efforts in countering those threats. So it's in this context that, as already a second step to an existing partnership with Gabon, we signed what we call a results-based payment agreement in 2019 that was launched at the UN Secretary General Summit. That was a commitment from the CAFI Trust Fund to Gabon to pay up to $150 million for reduced emissions and removals. And although it was something that was lauded, I think quite extensively, because it was quite a unique agreement, and we were happy to confirm the first results earlier this year. So the success story continues. So as I said, it was considered to be a major success for the continent. We have received criticism, and one of the issues that has been raised since this was that why would we pay for processes that are naturally occurring? And our position is that already it is not naturally occurring, in a sense that in order to preserve forests, you have to invest in protecting them, in studying them. And there may be opportunity costs that are lost if you have a more beneficial or profitable land use. But even if it was not the case, we still think, as it was mentioned very eloquently by Minister White, that these forests represent a global good, a value for humanity, climate change, biodiversity, rainfall, etc. And the international community should contribute to their protection. And even though the initial REDD+ efforts that you mentioned, so this initiative under the UNFCCC to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, actually the mechanism is called REDD+. So there is actually a plus there about the conservation and the enhancement of carbon stocks. So there is actually, the UNFCCC opened the door to supporting also these efforts. So not compensating based on reductions achieved, but actually the maintenance or the enhancement of these carbon stocks. Unfortunately, most of the methodologies that have been used, so in practice, this hasn't been really used. So as mentioned by Minister White, most of the focus has been on other forest basins, especially countries that have historically deforested a lot. And then they reduce those activities. So there was a comparison between what they have been doing and what they're doing now in terms of deforestation, and then compensating for that change. While countries like Gabon and other high forest and low deforestation countries have not been able to tap into these resources. There are many reasons. There are methodological reasons. It's also an issue of imminence and threat. So obviously the attention of the world was focusing on these hotspots. But I think more and more there's a recognition that we don't want these countries that are the last sanctuaries of both in terms of biodiversity and carbon to go down that path, that trajectory of descent into deforestation, and then stop later on and then come back and say that we have reduced. So that our objective, long-term objective, we are not there yet as CAFI, but I really hope we will be one day, is to create an incentive system which is predictable, long-term, and that rewards these good forest stewards. In our first agreement, we proposed to Gabon to compensate for removals. So not the actual stock, but the process of the forests of actually sucking carbon out of the air. We have found that this was not a very good methodology. The idea was actually to test ideas. So we also had to recognize that it wasn't the best approach, especially that it wasn't based on what happens on a net basis in the forest, so not the actual service that the Gabonese forests offer to this planet every year, because they do that. But again, this approach, which is very typical of the REDD+ mechanism, is comparing each year's performance to historical averages, so compensating for change, not the absolute service that is provided. So we are working on now with the government to see what kind of other ways could be developed to compensate for this, so that at the end of the day, forests can become kind of a resource, or almost like a revenue to the national economy, as other natural resources that are exploited, so that they really represent a value, not just for, globally, or not just like an inherent value, but actually it will be in the economic interest of these nations to keep themselves at this high forest, low deforestation level. Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting. I think to some extent, from at first glance, it may not sound complicated. The trees are there, they get some, there's some payment for something to link to carbon dioxide removal. But actually, as you said, what was really interesting is this is really hard, it's methodologically difficult. And so that in a way brings me to, I'm actually going to jump now to Alan, I think, because I wanted to pick up on this idea of, it's methodologically difficult. We need to test ideas. We need to figure out what to do. But what we do know is that your company has actually done extensive work with forest carbon consultants on developing a methodology that is relevant for forest-based projects, activities in Gabon. And I think what's nice is, you are trying to prove that improved forest management can produce significant carbon benefits. So can you sort of explain to us how this works in terms of, issuing carbon offsets linked to projects? And maybe you could just link that a little bit, so it's a lot of questions, sorry, to sort of other kinds of innovative climate finance mechanisms that forestLAB might be looking to engage in, such as green bonds. Is that too much?
A lot of questions. No, not at all. Not at all. I'll try not to take too much time in responding, but no, I think they're all absolutely pertinent questions, but I'm going to maybe reset perhaps the envelope of the questions that you asked, just to frame it in the way that we approach things. So firstly, as large African landscape investors and developers of large African landscapes, what we're interested in is the long-term use rights, or the property rights, really, that we hope to be able to invest in and develop over time. And in order to measure our progress and come to a conclusion in relation to the investment proposition, in the end, as I'm sure many people will understand, that's really about cash flow. It's about profits, and it's about finding ways, as certain as you can, about the cash that you're able to generate through the use rights, through the development of the use rights. And so that's one anchor point that we approach when one looks at a large landscape investment and development program. Secondly, of course, I think for anyone looking at a long-term investment and development program like ours, one has to be absolutely sure that one is acting sustainably. Now, for us, we use the old-fashioned definition of what that means, so that one is optimizing or doing what one can with the resources that are available to us today, but with one very, very important caveat, and that is that one is leaving the resources intact for future generations to make their own choices when their time comes. So those are two sort of launch pads for us in terms of how we look at projects like this. There are many others, including ensuring that biodiversity and human capital is in fact enhanced if we can go along with that. So for us, the journey starts with putting together a land use optimization plan to try to find how best we can optimize the land use rights across the entire landscape that we're hoping to operate in can be balanced. And we deliberately set, in terms of the sustainability argument, the biodiversity argument, we deliberately set the bar relatively high in relation to how we measure the impact of what we're doing progressively over the years. And I think, as many people on this call will understand, one of the very, very key developments over the last 20 years or so, particularly if you're looking at a HFLD country, just to use your phrase, one of the very key elements that we can crystallize very, very accurately is the amount of carbon stored or sequestered on the landscape. And so if one sets that as one of the high bars or the frames around which one looks at the investment and development optimization process, one then ends up in a situation where one is able to carefully assess what planned development might result in, from all the different perspectives that might be appropriate, including, of course, the pure economics and the commercial returns, but ranging across to the biodiversity and in this particular context, the volume of carbon stored. So for us, the question is, well, how do you measure your progress against what otherwise might happen? So our entire approach is to say, well, this is planned. This is the optimized planned development model. What might happen were we not here if unplanned development were to take place? And can we try and crystallize or quantify the consequences of unplanned development taking place versus a carefully coordinated and integrated long-term planned development proposition? And of course, in our case, the answer became yes, we could do so, and particularly if we used the delta between planned and unplanned development as measured by carbon stored on the landscape over a long period of time. So our starting point, and I think it's probably the way I'd advise others to proceed with. Our starting point was not to value the carbon in any way, but to use it as a metric to contrast the impact of planned versus unplanned development. From that, of course, we have evolved a methodology which rigorously tests tests our approach. How did we actually come to the scenarios for unplanned development? How do we find ways to properly measure, record, and validate what we're doing from a planned development perspective? And it's from that perspective that we've deviated quite substantially in the context of the early RED or avoided deforestation models to produce a methodology which is appropriate for large-scale forested landscapes like those in Gabon, looking to attract capital for long-term sustainable development and economic transformation, and to do so on a basis which ensures that not only is the program sustainable, but that its impact is carefully assessed and measured. And of course, what results from that is a methodology which essentially quantifies the beneficial impact of sustainable development in the context of what we're doing. And that methodology, we hope, will become widely accepted as an attractive way for certainly the Congo Basin investment and development scenarios to proceed with in relation to and not just from a carbon modeling perspective, but using carbon and carbon storage as a metric for measuring impact. From there, of course, one moves into what we hope will emerge from what Lee was referring to earlier, and what we hope will start emerging through the COP26 process and beyond, and the Paris Accords and so on, in relation to properly evaluating the long-term carbon storage of the Congo Basin as we go through the attraction of capital, the scaling up of opportunities, the development of the local economies, and hopefully the ongoing service that this region provides in relation to the battle against climate change.
Thank you. So we've got about 5 minutes before I open up to Q&A, but I've got a question to Minister White, Lee, and then I've got another question I want to put to Berta, so we'll try and leave about 5 or 6 minutes in total. So Lee, I'm thinking, Gabon has been historically dependent on oil revenues, and we already saw during COVID, when oil prices went negative briefly, just how dislocating that can be for an economy. And in a reduced carbon world, countries have to develop new sources of income. And this is going to mean deriving benefit from and revenues from your forests. And we've heard from Alan, about some of these sort of methodologies they're using. But maybe you can share with us what Gabon's model is for unlocking that commercial value from forests without sort of, compromising carbon sequestration, biodiversity. But also, I think, sometimes it's quite confusing when we hear, this sort of argument for sustainable forestry, sequestering more carbon than if a forest is left intact. And so I think it'd be quite useful for us to learn, you've only got a few minutes, but it would be useful for us to learn a little bit about the science of that, so we can have a clear understanding why, sustainable forestry and timber and felling can actually be part of the solution. Oh, you're muted.
Summarize 40 years of research in 2 minutes. I mean, as you said, oil economies are going to disappear. That creates a huge challenge for Gabon because 60% of our economy is oil. And so in terms of adaptation to climate change, diversifying our economy to replace those oil revenues is perhaps the biggest adaptation challenge for Gabon. And when we look at the sectors that have growth potential, our number one kind of growth potential sector, we think, is the forests. We make development decisions in the context of climate change, knowing that if we replace our forest with oil palm or soya beans or cattle, then it's bad for the climate and more people in Africa will die. And so we have to make that development decision in the context of the implications of our actions. We've developed a model in Gabon where we believe we can exploit timber sustainably, and by doing as much of the processing as possible in country, we can make the forest valuable to the Gabonese people by creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, both rural jobs and jobs for the urban. In a country, Gabon, we're almost 90% urban. We believe that if we can attract the investment we need in sophisticated timber processing, hopefully from many different nations, we can develop partnerships that will enable us to better look after, be better stewards of the forest. And we, to be frank, we don't see any other option. We think carbon payments might come in and make the industry more profitable, or at least allow us to invest in the climate resilient infrastructure that we need to be able to undertake this timber transformation industry. We think that other uses of the forest, whether it's medicinal plants, whether it's payment for ecosystem services, might also come in, but we don't see any alternative to the sustainable harvest of timber and the transformation of timber into value-added products. We're committed to 30% protected areas because we realize that when you log, you do change the forest, you do lose some of the sensitive biodiversity. So we're a member of the High Ambition Coalition pushing for 30% protected areas. And so the idea of managing landscapes where we have protected areas surrounded by sustainable forestry concessions with community forests and rural areas is what we're pushing for. And I guess time will tell whether or not it is going to work, but it seems to be working right now. And the further we go down the path, the more jobs we create, the more support there will be from the Gabonese people to preserve the rainforest. We have to make the forest valuable to the nation if they're going to survive.
Thank you. I think we haven't necessarily always been explicit, but of course, ultimately, it's about the population of Gabon, isn't it? And people and jobs and prosperity and reducing poverty, as well as providing, you know, what is really a gift to the planet in terms of this global public good of the forest. Berta, before we go to Q&A, we'll just sneak another minute for you. Maybe you can take us sort of to big picture a little bit as we move on to Q&A from our participants. And maybe you could just share us, what's your projection for stewardship of Central Africa's forests over the next 10 years? You know, this is an absolutely critical climate, critical decade for the fight against climate change. So how is this going to affect the global climate change trajectory if we see countries such as Gabon managing their forests in this way?
Well, I wish I had the answer. I can tell you what I hope will happen. As I mentioned, I think it's very important to find this predictable incentive system. I think it's very important for the international community to consistently reward good forest stewards, to find a way to do that, both in terms of methodologies, but also find the resources. And I think public donors, for example, in our trust fund, it's developed country governments who are supporting these processes. So I think they have an absolutely important role to play, and that they should continue to play that role. And there will be pledges at the COP in Glasgow. So I think that's going in that direction. I think there is still a need to increase the amount. I said at the beginning that we are the largest climate and forest fund of the UN, but our capitalization is between $0.5 and $1 billion. If you compare that with the GDP, even such a small country of Gabon, or their tax revenue, it's really very, very small. So how can you change like trajectories? How can you change macroeconomic processes with the availability of funding? This is where I think private sector comes in, and there are several initiatives. Alan spoke a little bit about their approaches, and there are others, how to mobilize big companies and deep pockets to contribute to this. And I think maybe a little bit neglected aspect is like global citizens. There are 7 billion people on this planet. And obviously, there are a lot of poor people still, unfortunately, but there is quite a lot of people who are living in relative comfort, for whom these issues are important, and trying to mobilize them to contribute, because as I mentioned, this is a global good. I think we have an opportunity to stop things, as mentioned by Minister White. The Central African forests are more resilient. We're talking about one of the few last places on this planet that are absorbing more carbon than they emit. It's huge. I think people should take a step back and think about it. We are thinking about, projecting decarbonizing economies in like 20 years or 30 years time. We actually have regions who are like that. So it's absolutely our responsibility, this generation's responsibility, to make this make this last. To make good forest stewards superstars, so that everybody wants to be like them, either stay like them or become like them. And I think it's going to be a hard fight, and we don't know how it's going to end. But yes, I think there are some promising prospects. We have also seen, the forest giant next to Gabon in DRC. We are seeing the plateauing out of deforestation and forest degradation. We are not yet sure if this is really happening, or it's just a statistical anomaly for the past 5 years. We're still talking about a lot of forest that is being lost, like 500,000 hectares. It's in absolute value, it's huge, but at least it's not going up. So what I want to say is, to conclude, is I really hope that we can seize this opportunity where people have finally understood the importance of protecting these ecosystems. We have the means, we have the technology, we have the funds, and it's not too late. And I think that would be a huge win for the global climate change agenda as well, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So look, we do have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to now open up the questions of the panel, put some of these questions to you. And if we can keep our answers really short, because I know it'd be really nice to get to as many questions as possible. And like I said, we've got 15 minutes, and then we've got to stick to time. There's a question from Kiragu Mwangi, who's regional representative of International Land Conservation Network. And I know Minister White's very kindly provided a typed answer, but I just wondered if Berta or Alan just wanted to add anything. What do you see as the role of civic and private organizations to achieve the ambitions set forth by governments such as Gabon for Africa's forests? Can you cite any examples of mechanisms in place to facilitate engagement? So I don't know, Alan, do you want to say anything, or Berta, we can go straight back to you?
Berta, you kick off and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if I understood the question. So it was to support the engagement or support the already the implementation of commitments?
I think it could be either. You know, the focus is on civic society, civic and private organizations to achieve the ambitions of the government. So it could be mechanisms that are in place, or, you know, just what can the private sector and civil society be doing more of?
Yeah, so I think for private sector, as I mentioned, very key aspect is the funding, and that is happening. If we're talking about civil society, again, I think there's a difference between, you know, local civil society, who has a very important role to play in awareness raising and working with local actors and local populations who are agents of change. And, you know, the global civil society, for me, it's one to influence political decision makers, to tell them this is important and it has to be supported. And as I mentioned, you know, maybe in a more distant future, to see how this can be really a collective effort of each individual who cares. We have the technology to make this work. So this is also something where I think they could help support and express support to those countries who are making these very important commitments and that are difficult to implement. So this is my short answer.
So I'll endorse that and amplify it. I think civil society is critical. Everything that we're experiencing right now is a function of perceptions across civil society generally, both in the regions and globally, about the critical need for action, and that is spurring everything that we're seeing, including in the capital markets, where the risk premium being applied to companies that don't act in accordance with what is now deemed to be essential. Those enterprises are simply not going to attract capital in certain sectors of the global economy. Are literally, you know, face, as we know, the fossil fuel sector and others are facing severe pressure in order to continue to operate, and that shifted around. Is absolutely everything for those of us looking to create long-term stability and economic development in these regions. And it's changed everything rather dramatically for those of us in the sustainable development field in Africa over the last few years, and I expect that will accelerate. So civil society has an absolutely crucial role to play in influencing politicians, government, and the capital markets generally.
Thanks. We have quite a few questions that are quite similar. And probably, Lee, I'll put it to you, Minister White, that we've got Mike Plants, Conservation Media Advisor in Nairobi. We've got Kiragu Mwangi. Sort of a lot of people asking about how sort of the countries can work together. So what about other countries, particularly where the state support's either not there or the authorities are not so good at creating that framework? So you know, how can those countries sort of, you know, achieve what Gabon's achieving, and how can countries in the region sort of work together?
Yeah, in Congo Basin, we have pretty good coordination. We have the Central African Economic Community and the COMIFAC organization that help to coordinate forest policy, climate policy across the whole region. So yeah, of course, as Minister for Gabon, I focus on getting things right in Gabon, but I do spend a lot of time talking to my counterparts. The minister from DRC was actually due here today, but had a logistical issue. So there's lots of exchange. But I think really to move us forward, the international community has to send some very clear signals. I was doing a back of the envelope calculation yesterday. In DRC, deforestation rates have increased in the last 5 to 10 years. And so when you look at Global Forest Watch, it looks like they're losing about 500,000 hectares of tropical forest every year. And each hectare probably has about 500 tons of CO2 stored in it. And if those tons of CO2 are worth $10, we might argue they're worth more, but if they're worth $10, then that's $2.5 billion worth of CO2 that's going into the atmosphere every year. So why don't we have a fund of $2.5 billion to support modernizing of the agriculture in DRC, to improve agricultural methods, to turn the agriculture into a carbon positive agriculture? Why aren't we investing those sorts of sums of money, which are the sorts of sums of money that we're going to have to invest if we're going to turn climate change around? Why is it only, let's say, $10 million through FAO, not $10 billion that the world is willing to put into securing these ecosystem services? And I think, you know, if we were able to really mobilize the support and the funding and the technology exchange that we need, that would bring other rainforest countries along. Making Gabon into an example might help a little bit, but we really have to get to scale. And I think that example is maybe a good one. If we're doing over $2 billion worth of damage to the atmosphere every year, surely it's worth investing 5 times that to actually turn things around.
Thank you. I think so important to keep reminding us about how important climate finance is and mobilizing the funding. And of course, and agriculture as well, incredibly important in African countries. We've got a question here from Matthew Lewis, University of Cambridge, and I think we haven't talked about this so much explicitly today, but I know it's a lot of us talk about this and are very aware. But he says local and indigenous communities have a vital role to play in restoration and protection of natural capital in Gabon. How is Gabon going to ensure that their voices are heard and communities are empowered to protect natural capital?
I guess that's another one for me. The way we look at it in Gabon, we don't really distinguish between local people and urban people. All Gabonese people are equal in the constitution. Some live in rural settings, some live in urban settings. Actually, the way our electoral system works, rural people's votes are worth a lot more per person than urban votes. So you need a lot more votes in the capital city to become elected to parliament than you do in rural Lope, which is where I'm from. And so we have electoral processes. We have representation which works. We have I get a lot of hassle and a lot of pressure from rural members of parliament when it comes to human-elephant conflict, when it comes to the issues of whether or not forestry companies are contributing sufficiently to the local economies in rural areas. And then, as other people say, civil society, we have a very active and vocal civil society who then magnify those institutional mechanisms. So we have to focus on making sure that the development process is equitable and that we're creating rural jobs and urban jobs in the proportions that we need to do, and that's the way the ministry at least is looking at this challenge.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that. Otherwise, there's been quite a few questions that actually refer back to some of the earlier comments. Oh, sorry, Alan, did you want to comment?
No, I was just going to say that really the question cuts right to the core of the notion of ensuring that planned development is optimal versus the consequences of unplanned development. A lot of the time we're speaking about, for example, the underpopulated or low rural populations that exist in parts of Gabon, certainly the areas that we're operating in. But one doesn't have to cast the net too far to see that just a few hundred kilometers away, several hundred kilometers away, are some of the most densely populated parts of Africa, both within the Congo Basin and to the south, and even to the north. The issue is, as you stimulate economic development and the opportunities for that generates start attracting people, and then the question is, how do you deal with that in a planned, rational, organized, and equitable way? So our program is all about ensuring that that's precisely what happens, the notion of planned development. What Lee hasn't spoken about, of course, is the consequences of not doing this, particularly as the threats of climate change start imposing real difficulties on people living in the less developed and the less privileged parts of Africa. We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of people who are placed in a position where they're climate refugees if things don't go in a way which is hopefully capable of reversing or altering that course. And that's a key issue in terms of the development paradigm that we face. So investment is critical and necessary. It has to be sustainable in the context of the way in which we've tried to describe things today, but it also has to ensure an equitable outcome for people. And the consequences of not doing so are potentially really, really tragic for the entire region.
Thank you. Yeah, I think these are really important points. I'm just thinking we've probably got about time for one more question, but there's just a lot of fantastic questions here, and I'm going to ask our panel, maybe, you know, if you can. I've noticed some of you've been typing answers, which is brilliant, while also answering questions real time. There have been several questions, interestingly, about you know, elephant as an important sort of species. And, you know, we've heard about, you know, the problem of elephant-human conflict that has to be dealt with. There's a question here from Jonas and Guhu Pufung about sort of, you know, how we come back to the case of elephants, also mentioned by a participant, Walid. But is there a way to consider a holistic approach to, and I suppose this is really, you know, people working with nature, not against nature. So we've had a lot of discussion about climate change. Minister White mentioned right at the beginning, you know, that the Gabonese forests, the Congo Basin forests, provide so much more than carbon sequestration. How do we deal with some of these issues where there can be a conflict with humans, but we know that, you know, wildlife does need protecting in some way? But I don't know if that's something you sort of address or not, or
no, maybe Minister White
yeah?
is a better answer than me.
And these forests are ecosystems. They're not coal. They're not diamonds. They're living carbon, living, breathing carbon. And so they have to be managed as an ecosystem. If we eliminate the wildlife from the forest, then who's going to plant the trees? How are we going to have regeneration? So when we manage the forest for sustainable forestry, we also manage it for sustainable wildlife, because the wildlife is critical to the functioning of the forest. The reason we fight so determinedly against elephant poaching and the over harvest of wildlife by criminal gangs, not sustainable or kind of subsistence hunting, but the commercial massacre of wildlife, is because when you kind of disrupt the ecology of the system, that's when things go wrong. That's, you know, you just look to Europe, all this evidence that a biodiverse forest is much more resistant to drought and to fire. In the Mediterranean, fire, and in Northern Europe, disease. The same thing applies to tropical rainforests. If we maintain the functioning of the ecosystem, we're less likely to have emergent diseases escaping from our biodiverse rainforests. The reason we focus so much on carbon is because there is a carbon market, not a global, not a kind of coordinated carbon market, but there are various carbon markets out there, and we know how to assign value to carbon. We don't know how to assign value to ecosystem services yet. It's something I think that forestLAB is going to really dig into. I think the combined sort of ecological and economic capacity of LSE and Stirling, the reason that they've been brought together is because we want to dig into the value. What is the value to Gabon of the gorilla that plants the gambea tree and plants the elephant that's, as people said, is distributing the mwabi tree and so on. Should we be paying the elephants or paying the elephants for their service? At least, if we're not going to pay the elephants, at least providing them with a safe forest in which to live and to continue to play that ecosystem service that is valuable to us. And so ecosystem level, landscape, nature-based management, creating climate resilient landscapes, I think is really the way we're thinking about it. And we're learning by doing as we move along.
Well, thank you. Well, that brings us, unfortunately, to the end of the panel session and almost the end of our gathering today. I think it really sums up the fact that we're really excited about the work that forestLAB is going to be doing, and it's called forestLAB for a reason. Just as Minister White said, there's lots of unanswered questions, and I think a lot of exciting work to be done. So can I just thank so much Minister White? Can I thank Alan Bernstein? Can I thank Berta Pesti? And of course, thank again Baroness Shafik and our two professors, Jump and Professor Ngomanda. What a fantastic panel. I could chat with you all day because this is just such an exciting topic, very close to my heart. But we do have to end, unfortunately, but we're not finished yet because I keep saying unfortunately, but we have, not in person, but Right Honourable Lord Zach Goldsmith, who is the UK Minister for Pacific and the Environment at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, has recorded some words for us just to end this gathering today because he was unable to be with us today. He's the minister who's leading the UK's COP26 nature campaign and international strategy. And I think for many of us in the UK, we know him also as a keen advocate for environmental issues and sustainability around the world. So we will now turn to Right Honourable Lord Zach Goldsmith for his final words. I think that should be now.
Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be able to say a few words. From Ghana to Guyana, countries with high forest cover and low forest loss are not only massively important, they're absolutely vital, and the world owes them a debt of gratitude. To consider the Congo Basin, it's hard to overstate its importance. The second largest tropical forest in the world, it's one of the world's key biodiversity jewels. 3/4 of the world's forest elephants, half the world's lowland gorillas, chimpanzees, giant pangolin, 1,000 bird species, 400 mammal species, and at least 10,000 species of plants, 30% of which are found nowhere else on Earth, all depend on those forests. In the DRC alone, 5 of its national parks are World Heritage Sites, home to forest elephants, hippos, the okapi, 3 of the great apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, and the gentle bonobo, as well as countless other primates, like the black colobus and the world's biggest monkey, the mandrill. And we know that the Congo Basin is one of the few forests that is still a net carbon sink on a vast scale. Together, the Central African forests capture more than 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide every single year. That's 4% of global emissions. And a UK Congo research team found that the Cuvette Centrale, the world's largest tropical peatland, holds around 3 years' worth of global fossil fuel emissions. Now, these rainforests supply half of all rainfall across Africa, and that in turn underpins the food and water security of millions upon millions of people. And of course, the Congo Basin is also home for around 80 million people, including nearly 1 million indigenous people and local communities who have protected these forests against the odds for generations. Put simply, if we were to lose great forests such as these, we would have zero chance of stabilizing the world's climate or of reversing the catastrophic biodiversity loss that the world is experiencing. And our shared global development goals would simply slip beyond reach. So we must not let that happen. And it's right that our shared challenge is to help protect and restore these forests as a top priority, and to do so by ensuring that we improve the livelihoods of the people who depend on them most directly. That is our priority for COP26 and beyond, to ensure a greater recognition for and more support for the world's forests. Now, the flip side is that by protecting forests, we're also addressing so many other major challenges that we face, from poverty even to pandemics. And it's worth remembering that the world's poorest people, who suffer first and worst when nature's free services fail, those same communities stand to benefit from turning things around. Now, clearly no country can solve this problem alone, but together we can. We have all the tools we need. All that remains is the political will. So as well as co-leading global alliances committed to protecting at least 30% of the world's land and ocean by 2030, we're pulling every lever we've got to accelerate systemic change, from building global alliances of countries committed to reorientating governmental support towards sustainable land use and agriculture, and to breaking the link between commodity supply chains and deforestation. Alliances pressing for the big multilateral development banks to nature-proof their entire portfolios, and to getting private finance flowing for forests. And that includes the high-integrity voluntary carbon markets that will enable us to do so much more. And we're clear that when governments and businesses come together to provide the largest ever commitments of finance for protecting tropical forests, these funding mechanisms absolutely must recognize and reward high forest, low deforestation countries, as well as helping others move away from deforestation towards reforestation. Now, clearly none of this is going to be easy. If it were, we'd be having a very different conversation today and at COP26. But there is room for optimism. There is very little that needs to be done that is not already being done by someone somewhere, including in Central Africa. From Gabon becoming the first African country to be paid to protect its rainforest, to Guyana leading the way in the Caribbean by strengthening governance and legality in supply chains, and CAFI working across this region to accelerate reform, mobilize finance, and take action. And on the back of our commitment to double UK international climate finance and invest at least £3 billion in solutions that protect and restore nature, we're working with many of you in the Western Congo Basin through our new Biodiverse Landscapes Fund, providing safe passage for wildlife like mountain gorillas and green jobs for people in Cameroon, Gabon, and the Republic of Congo. COP26 is now just a few weeks away, and we're determined to use our presidency to help turn that sort of best practice into the norm. At the start of the climate conference, the Prime Minister will be asking world leaders to commit to taking further action that will help the world to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030, and get the ball rolling on the finance and the policies that we need to meet that target during this decade. And your incredible forests will be at the heart of that. And the UK will continue to step up and work with you. So thank you so much for hosting such a crucially important discussion. And thank you for all that you do.
Gosh, we're coming to a close now. So I just say thank you again to our guest speakers. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the participants. It's a difficult time, I think, for a lot of people at the moment. And I hope, like me, you sort of feel a little uplifted after this session we've had today, this gathering, that we feel, a lot of optimism. And I hope each of us will take away something from this meeting. I'm just going to go right back to something said at the beginning, that the Congo Basin is absorbing 5 times more carbon than the Amazon. It's absorbing the equivalent of 4% of global emissions. It matters so much. We can tell from the number of people here attending. We can tell from the questions. I wish we could have engaged with all the questions in great detail, but there's never enough time. And I think we can tell from the passion from the speakers today just how critically important this is and how much hope and optimism I think we can have going forward. So thank you everybody so much. And I think I can now declare this session closed. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, one all.